The world is becoming increasingly proficient at telling stories that deny God. As such, we need Thinking Christian to become as natural as breathing. Welcome to the Thinking Christian podcast. I'm Dr. James Spencer. And through calm, thoughtful, theological discussions, Thinking Christian highlights the ways God is working in the world and questions the underlying social, cultural, and political assumptions that hinder Christians from becoming more like Christ. Now, on to today's episode of Thinking Christian. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I'm joined again by the hosts of the Bible Unbranded podcast, Rebekah Josberger and Renee, Duffy. And we're going to continue our conversation of Deuteronomy. And today we're really going to focus in on, we're going to use the Sabbath as sort of an example of how to go about interpreting laws within a theological framework, one might say. And so thinking about how these laws convey something of the character of God and something of the underlying realities of the world that we're trying to live in. And along the way, then we'll address probably how might the church think about Sabbath rest even in today's world. So we'll get a little practical as well. But that's where we're headed. And so welcome back. It's great to have you both here. And thanks for being on.
It's really nice to be here and have these conversations. So thank you very much for this collaboration.
Yeah. You know, I was thinking about this. I've been teaching Hebrews on Wednesday mornings with this group that I do. And when I was thinking about our conversation about how this works from a theological perspective, that notion of shadow and substance, or shadow and copy that Hebrews uses, and the way it gestures up to sort of this quote unquote heavenly reality, or as I like to refer to it as the substance, that gets a little platonic. So I don't want people to think that I'm like just drawing on that. But the idea is that so much of what we do and so much what Hebrews describes from an Old Testament perspective is gesturing toward something in that language better. And it's not that this stuff that we're exhibiting right now isn't real or isn't good. It's just that there's something ahead of us that's so much better that these things that we're living in now are gesturing toward. They're pointing us toward them. They're creating sort of an ache that that conditions us to move in that direction, as I like to think of it. And so I'm wondering how that framework might fit with something like when we go to a Sabbath command, or really any command, whether that framework is a helpful framework, coming from the book of Hebrews back into the Old Testament and saying, what if we started thinking about these things as copies and shadows, without diminishing them, but also really thinking about them as how are they pointing us somewhere forward? So I'll just leave that. I'll just start us there as a conversation starter, and either of you can start. What do you think?
I have tons to say, but I want to, if Renee wants a chance to respond, get it now.
No, you're fine. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's so fun, James, talking to you about these things, because genuinely you bring up all these things in the New Testament that I, of course, believe in and of course read. But because for so many factors, I have stayed primarily as an Old Testament scholar. I remember one day I heard someone, I think it was Tremper Longman, and he said in a conversation, he said, I think it was him, I'm an Old Testament scholar and a New Testament layperson. And I thought, okay, there's a space allowed for that. So that's me. But the reason I understand Hebrews better now is because, so I don't have to go backwards to do that. That's how I'm understanding Hebrews. The thing that I want to address is there's this idea in scholarship that has been proposed about the law by people I respect really highly, people who have influenced me by their writings. But I disagree with this perspective, and it's that in the idea of it pointing us forward, it's almost got, and this is not the scholar's language, this evolutionary model, like God wanted to fix things up, but it was so messed up, he had to start slowly, and things like polygamy or slavery or all of those things have to get kind of pointed towards something better in the here and now. And that, if you have training in that background and are hearing that, you might think that I'm affirming that. That's not how I see it at all. No. I think this is what you were alluding to. That, and I don't even want to restate what you said, but the idea that, but I'm going to try anyway. The idea that what law is calling for, or anything that we're doing down here, when we see but a glimpse of how great and how right everything will be. And I see that in a couple of ways out of my own study of Deuteronomy. One of them, and I think we talked about this last time, is that if we assume rather than these laws somehow built this utopia, that if we could just get back to that, we would be a more righteous nation or whatever. Rather than that, if we see that these laws are expressing elements of the character of God, that in settings where they might be applicable, not because of the characters in the setting, but because of issues that arise out of that kind of brokenness. So like marriage brings a lot of like conflict of hierarchy and, family, whatever. So the settings create a good spot for this thing to be practiced, whatever it is, whether it's human dignity or use of authority or not morality. Anyway, I'm looking for a word. We would call it modesty or something like that.
Sure.
But they're practiced, character of God, by broken people. And then when Christ comes, we talked about this last time, he's practicing the character of God as God. And obviously, in the future, whatever heaven looks like, no idea. There's that reality thing. For us, it's in the future, Yeah. And that's the thing we are getting glimpses of who God is. So that's all kind of like a big fancy explanation. And this is where I think Renee, maybe, we haven't talked about it, but might be able to help and add to the conversation, is the reason that seems to be happening is rhetorical. It's almost literary, in that you have the God of the universe. I was trying to write this out yesterday in a different context, and if I wrote incomparable and incomprehensible one more time, it just trying to describe who the Almighty is and what that looks like through words and deeds and examples for which we have no paradigm. So literally, at its very best, all we could see is a shadow. Because I don't even know how we're going to get the comprehension. You tell me that I could live like even just a utopia. I don't know that I want to. I like to struggle a little bit. I have to earn something. There's all these concepts we can't even get our brains around. And so in God's humility and desire to reach us, he conveys them the only ways we can understand them, and those are but a shadow. So both of those pieces, I think, are absolutely fundamental to what's going on in law. And that's why when I read Hebrews, I'm like, oh, thank you. This is why, when Abraham's called righteous, or other characters that we look at and go, I guess it was fine that he sent his wife off to a harem to save his life. Okay. And Abraham is a great example. And he's a shadow of so anyway, I'll stop there.
Right.
Can you help with all my...
I'm kind of interested, because Rebekah brought it up, but, that literary aspect, I'd be interested to hear you talk about it. And then, I've got a couple of thoughts I'll share too.
Yeah. I mean, first I want to just acknowledge that I think what all three of us are like building all these guardrails, right, to the thing that James introduced to talk about, which is, I'm interested to actually get to talk about. But, I will also just add to the guardrails, I guess, in that, we all have this risk of falling into the fallacy of time snobbery, right? Like we look back and we think, oh, these are all the things that have been fixed already. Like polygamy's fixed now, so that means we must be further along. But the reality is like you're identifying, it's incomparable. We can't understand the nature of God, the perfection of Jesus in flesh, who is God. And so this is one of the reasons why we have so much story and narrative in our Bibles, right? Is because this is something we can relate to. It's something that we can begin to comprehend because there's overlap with all human experience and with the use of narrative that's like hit just throughout all of human history. Narrative has been an important way that we figure out who we are and how we connect to the past and where we go in the future and what's happening to us now and what's happened then. And so all of this are these layers that God has graced us with so that we can begin to comprehend in our moment. But at any given moment along the way, God has accommodated himself to us through these ways. And so rather than there is progression, right? There's a redemptive history that moves forward, but humanity isn't really what has moved forward if we're going to talk about being like right. God and understanding God. God has moved his redemptive plan through, but we're still humans. We still can't get it. And so it's important to know that while there are things that we see differently than ancient peoples did, they still got so much, just like we get so much. And so instead being able to read narrative or read law in context to the best of our ability, and then looking to the person of God, which is, what we're here, like poised to begin doing, is helpful in keeping that guardrail of that time snobbery instead of trying to place ourselves in a place, which is what you were talking about, I think, Becky, this idea that they've put forward that there's something that, has changed with us when there really isn't. We're still struggling just as much as any other generation has struggled through all of time.
Yeah, I think it's important to put the qualifier of the evolutionary aspect on it. And I think that what we want to avoid is thinking that we're making some sort of progress. I think more what we see in Hebrews is something akin to what I've been reading. This will be like my super geek moment. I've been reading Philip Reif, his book, Life and the Death Works. And he talks about culture in terms of sacred order and social order, and culture transliterates the sacred order into a social order. And so what I see in Hebrews is this moment, this post-resurrection moment, and I use moment as sort of the epoch, right? Yeah. This post-resurrection moment is now telling the community of faith, look, your social order needs to reflect a new sacred order. There's something very different post-resurrection of Christ that everybody in the Christian community needs to recognize and then reflect within community. And so that is better than what you had before, but that's very different than saying it's an evolutionary move. What you're seeing is you've got the way I think about it, and I think there has some rooting in Hebrews, because in the first chapter you have the setup between the revelation given by angels and the revelation given by the Son. And so there's something to, if we think about God's self-disclosure, about God being hidden and God being or making himself present, making himself available to us. Yeah. And so what I think we have in the Old Testament law is very good. When he makes the contrast between what's given through the angels and what's given through the Son, he's not saying oh, and by the way, throw out everything that the angels ever told you. In fact, in that chapter, he quotes the Old Testament multiple times. So it's not a jettisoning of this old revelation, but it's a recognition that now we have something different and better that we have to incorporate and embody. And so I think there's a really interesting move to be made to say, now as we're reading Old Testament law, yes, it still reflects God's character. And as we read it as a reflection of God's character, we also have a further revelation in the Son that helps us even understand the Old Testament law that much better. Now, I'm an Old Testament guy, and so I'm very cautious of like, hey, let's just do Christological readings of the Old Testament. I don't believe that's what we should do, right? But I do think that it's impossible for us to divorce ourselves from the context in which we have the Son revelation and try to read the Old Testament as if that weren't there.
Sure.
Right. And so that's always a tension for me, because I don't particularly gravitate toward Christological readings of the Old Testament. I think we need to read the Old Testament on its own terms and allow it to sort of then organically connect into Christ, as opposed to like saying, nope, that the angel of the Lord is Jesus. It's a, Christophany or something. Like, I just don't really love that sort of move, but hopefully that clarifies it. I love that sort of sacred order, social order, just, explanation, and the culture, which would be, in this case, the literary, as you were talking about, Renee. But I would also say the symbolic, the structural, right? The temple, its cultus, the legal, the laws, to the extent that we would separate that from a literary, right? You have all these different layers that now create a culture that are conveying, for lack of a better term, belief, right? This is the reality we believe the sacred order to be. And so we're structuring our lives around it here and now. And then as you get to Hebrews, you kind of sit back and you go, oh, okay, there is a new sacred reality because Jesus is risen. He's been given authority over heavens and the earth. And, he's in a new place. We have a new high priest, and they're teasing out all of these things. And it's like, now this has different implications for how we order ourselves.
Yeah.
So that's sort of my broader thought process.
It reminds me, not to drag us backwards, but as you're talking about this, new reality, we reincorporate, right? We reinterpret with what we know. And how, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, right, and that's the exciting part, right? That us on this side of resurrection, this is exciting for us, and we can understand that, and actually being able to use that experience to understand what was exciting about what was happening in the Old Testament for them, that God was doing and showing up in new and exciting ways, and how that was reinterpreting the world around them, and how he used the cultural things around them in order to do that. All of that kind of piled in together is some of what I get the most excited about. So,
agreed. Yeah. Becky?
I was just going to say, I'm definitely going to go listen to this podcast again so I can figure out everything you were saying, because this, and I'm not tongue in cheek, this is a question that students ask me all the time about, the relationship between the two and what's new and what's different, that because it might be a weakness of mine. I'm not sure. I don't know. But because of how much I've sat in the law and how I see all those exciting things pointed out, and this will bring us right back to Sabbath. And I'm going to make some, you do too. I haven't finished reading the dissertation yet. I'm super excited about it though, but, this will bring us right back to the Sabbath, and I'm going to make super big claims about what the Sabbath is designed to help the people practice as part of their weekly routine. And it's so exciting that it includes the cross. Like, even though they don't know that, it includes the cross rather than, in my opinion, rather than somehow being changed by the cross. So I really struggle, not with the concepts, but like literally with understanding or explaining the concepts. It's a thought in my outworking of my own teaching or my theology that I haven't found ways to articulate. So I loved what you said, and will definitely be listening to it again to go like, okay.
Well, I will say, just as a sort of a plug, I was led to Philip Reef's Life and the Death Works through Kevin Flatt's book called Secularization, Social Order, and World History, which I would recommend all over the place. I think he does a fantastic job. He doesn't deal with Christianity up front.
Right.
He really starts with Confucianism and Islam and various other things. And he shows how the sacred social order actually works through these other traditions. And it's really fantastic. Yeah. So I was definitely led back to Reef from him, and we want to give him attribution for that. But either way, we can, let's move into Sabbath a little bit and talk through, how does Sabbath then convey the character of God? I think the easy one is, you look at it in Exodus, it's rooted in creation. There's something about the ordering of time and the keeping that time set apart that creates a cadence in our lives, a sort of notion that God desires to give rest somehow, a notion that God is the ultimate provider and that our work is important, but ultimately insufficient in some way. Like, there are a lot of things I think we could tease out of that, but it is interesting to think, like, you have the creation, then you have the Exodus reference in Deuteronomy 5. And so, Sabbath is a sign that we are now under the order of God and how that relates to the created order. Like, there's a lot of ways we could take this. So I'm kind of interested to see, where should we start? How do we move from something like a Deuteronomy 5:12 through 15 to a statement about who God is? And
when the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love. I'm gonna praise. World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
I would argue that needs to be even apart from what's embedded in the text, right? That God is the one who brought Israel out of slavery, right? Because that's explicit there. But I think there's more layer to it. I don't know whether you both agree to that, but maybe if I can start with Renee, like, when you think about creation, Exodus, narratively across Genesis through Exodus, let's say, and then you think about Sabbath commands, is there an intuitive sense in which that connects for you?
I'm not 100% sure what you're asking. We talked, Becky and I talked a little bit last week, so I'll kind of I'll share where we went, and maybe it does, and maybe it'll be like not what I was thinking at all. But we were thinking about the difference. I was thinking about the difference in the idea that creation is put forth in Exodus, and the Exodus is put forth in Deuteronomy, but it's not because the Exodus hasn't happened in Exodus. It just happened, right? Like, there's something about it being so fresh in their minds, in this thing that, again, they're thinking about, and they're trying to make connections of what is happening, like what just happened, who is this God, who are we, what's going on. They're in the middle of that narrative of their life. And so in the middle of actually experiencing it, where it's fresh, they need to hear about creation, because there's this recreating happening. And then as they move forward, there's a way in which the Exodus almost supplants creation in some ways, right? Like it's still very important. It's still part of all of their narrative, but it becomes the pinnacle moment for the people that explains who they are even way after it's over. And so there must be some way in which, not must be, obviously there is this way in which the creation and the Exodus are connected so tightly that it can take this place as they're going through it, and then after they go through it, the thing they went through, the Exodus, can then sit in that spot and do the same thing that creation did in the first one.
So let me ask this just as a follow-up. That's getting at what I'm thinking. So okay. When you think about that connection, creation, because there's been a lot written on this. I remember Terence Fretheim, I think, wrote a book on connecting creation and Exodus. And so there's typological things you can do with it. There's all these different connections you can make.
Sure.
But one of the things I've always been sort of fascinated by is the narrowing down to Israel. And I think ultimately you can make the argument of narrowing down all the way to Christ. But certainly in this setting, narrowing down to Israel of a creation vocation. So now they are essentially, and I don't mean this vernacular in an overly technical fashion, but they are the firstborn that have now they've taken up the mantle of carrying the covenant forward into these multiple generations. And part of the way they would demonstrate that is by keeping the law and, for our purposes, keeping the Sabbath. And that now connects them to this deeper creation vocation. Does that ring true to you, Renee? And you don't have to,
as you know, I'm doing this work with Jacob right now, and I'm literally in the thick of thinking about what he does and doesn't do.
Yeah.
And so as you're saying that, I'm just thinking, they have this creation mandate, and yet they're not actually doing it. Their participation in it is being the vessel of God's promises.
Yeah.
And that comes with not doing at least one day of the week.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I just think it's important to kind of get there and wrestle with it, because I don't know. And Becky, I'll let you kind of wax philosophical on this, but just so you understand why I'm taking this line of questioning, is I think it's kind of important to situate it within the overarching narrative that's come before, at least a little bit. Mm-hmm. And to me, that gives us some clues about what we might say about God in this context. So I don't know how you think about it, Becky, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Okay, I want to pad this by saying that one of the things that I have personally learned about myself by working with Renee is that my charging in and clashing at something to wrestle with it for my sake can sound like shutting everything else down and proposing something brand new. So no, here's what happened. And that's not what I'm trying to say. In fact, when we podcast, here's a little secret. And Renee's at our podcast table right now, and I'm not. But we have a little thing on my desk that says, yes, and, so that I can practice going, no. Instead of doing that, saying, yes, and. So this is not to say this is just sorry, that's who I am. And honestly, that's how I mean this, even when I'm combating. But I am not great with philosophical ideas, and I'm trying to see simply what is going on. And so hyperbole, exaggeration, those are all black and white. That's all part of how I do this. So this is going to come through right now in that. What I'm hearing, I think even sometimes in your language, James, is something that I hear all the time in scholarship. And it's very important, but it's not how my brain works. I will say that one of the things about talking to you that's so helpful is I feel such a safety to be who I am and what my brain, I mean, it's wonderful to talk to you, and I can start to figure out things that I'm hearing from others that I'm not quite understanding. But I think you keep talking about what's happening in the scriptures, even with Sabbath, biblical law, almost like it's on a timeline, a redemptive timeline, and where the people are in that timeline and how things are changing or how this affects them in order to understand how God's working and moving. And that's, I mean, everybody's interested in that except me. So it's totally valid and important and all of those things. For me, because I think I grew up in that culture and I, by nature, combat anything that's the standard so that I can understand it better. I would almost go far to say, and this is an exaggeration because it's absolutely not true. I'm going to go back and root everything in how the people look at the world. But my exaggerated explanation would be, I don't care at all about the people. Now, that's not true, but they're not the thing that I'm trying to learn about. They're not the piece that I want to emulate. They're not even the piece usually that the author is telling us an evaluation of how they're doing with God. So in my very black and white kind of approach, which might be unique to me, anytime I'm looking at what the people's role is going to be before I get to the very end of my working through something, I am shutting myself down and going, no, all I really care about is what God is saying about himself. So, for example, yes, maybe the people are part of a new creation and blah, blah, blah. And I see that, but I see that as part of helping me understand what God is saying about himself. So, how does this apply, for example, to Sabbath? Unless either of you want to respond to that, because I know for me that it's a little bit hyperbolic in the way I express it. I can go there.
No, it's cool. I'll just say this. I don't disagree with you. So when I was doing my work, honestly,
I don't disagree with you either. It's just the way I.
Yeah, no, I know. I think that I would say I'm doing something very similar to what you're doing from a slightly different angle.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was doing my study on the Sabbath, I actually was always thinking, I don't really care if the Israelite people practice the Sabbath. It doesn't matter.
And reading your stuff that I've read so far, I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't care. Like, because it's inscribed in the text, that is, and from the perspective I was looking at, that is the cultural memory. That's what is inscribed there. That just the inscription of it makes it important whether they practice this or not. That doesn't make any difference. And so when I'm talking about these sort of through scripture themes, my thinking is more attuned to what cultural memory is being reconstructed in the moment where the Sabbath command is being written down and re-given.
Yeah.
And in my sort of constellation of the way I think about it, God is a social agent within the setting of Israel, and he's pictured that way in scripture. And so when I'm doing that, I'm assuming a lot that I'm not saying that you're articulating. So I think that's why I resonate exactly with what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because I'm going, that's exactly what I'm doing, but I'm not making it clear. I'm not articulating it. So I'll just say that.
You're polite. I'm just like, guys, stop. And I'm also used to working with students who don't understand the differences. So if I look at all of Scripture, which I do, this is my biblical theology, as the revelation of God and his outworking with creation, which happens to hold, we talked about this in the Genesis podcast, humanity in a very special place, but it's with all of creation. So everything in Scripture is, for me, revealing more about the character of God. And this may or may not be too simplistic, but there are places when he is giving explicit instructions or descriptions of who he is, and they just are emphatic statements. Here's who I am. And we have language for it, but we can't understand the depth or extent of what it means when God does these things. When I am patient, it means I put up with my granddaughter, who's now a toddler, and could just be walking through and meeting her at her level all day without losing my temper. When God is patient, he will watch people murder children in the name of religion for thousands of years without wiping them off the planet. So we're talking two different levels of all these things, love, whatever. So he makes his descriptive statements, but because those, again, are so beyond what we can grasp, he also shows examples of who he is. And I know they're written by human authors, but I'm looking at, and that becomes a big play in my understanding of literature in the Old Testament, but those are like when you have a relationship with a person or a people group for God, because he lives a lot longer than we do, over time, we call that history. And so he's got all of these examples of how he has walked from the beginning of time when he created them until like the story of Esther, where even though they're not anywhere near their old practices that they could do, and they feel like God's already rejected them and thrown them out, he's coming back and saying, look at this insane things I'm going to do to protect you. So all the way through, he's showing who he is in relationship to them. And I think it's really important to talk about the history of it, the story of it, all of those things. But then he has like these prescriptive pieces where I haven't tried this word before. Renee just said something that triggered it in me. She talked about how story is so an important way of communicating, or everything you said about story. To me, law is practiced story. So if story is showing us what God looks like in tangible form as he's dealing with his people, then law is like, okay, now you go practice it. And for me, one of the law is always going to be telling us something more about the character of God. And I gave this example last time in Deuteronomy 10 when it says like, I took care of you when you were foreigners in Egypt, and I took care of you, so you go take care of other foreigners in your land. Like, you're going to fundamentally look like I do because of who I am. And there's all kinds of implications for that, for like what that tells us about God. But for right now, holding on to that idea that behind his instruction is something he wants us to understand about him, and he wants us to understand it by practicing it. And in Sabbath, by practicing it regularly, literally every 7 days, which I remember the day I learned that it was likely that God didn't invent the 7 days, but that the structure of a week was already in place in society because they understood things. It's not that he didn't invent it, but that he was using a time structure to say regularly in the way you order time. And the thing behind the thing, the thing about God that both the reasons he gives that we're supposed to reflect. In other words, we're doing the law because it's telling us something about who he is, and the becauses are because on the seventh day I rested, and I created everything, and I created it all perfectly, and on the seventh day I rested. And you were in slavery, and I rescued you. And so those are both pictures of this fulfillment, and I can't wait to go read the book Connecting Creation and Exodus, because I'm seeing a clear connection between those two. But those are pictures of the completion, the perfection, the redemptive elements of God And he doesn't ask us to do something to practice completion, or he asks us to not do anything and rest in the fact that he has done it. So when I'm talking to students about Genesis 1, if we have enough time, one of the things I like to tell them is, I know that culturally we have had a long history of getting like, is it 7 days or isn't it? And can you be a Christian if you think da-da-da-da-da-da-da? And what does this have to do with science? And I'm like, if I told you that all of the creation narrative was leading up to a weekly practice of celebrating, for lack of a better word, heaven. Wouldn't that mystery and the desire to experience that and overshadow that, or wouldn't that overshadow any question of like how this happened? Or that's not the point. The point is, oh my goodness, I serve a God who sees me whether it's in the chaos or the redemption, and he has promised to do this thing, and he's done it before, like twice now, once for the globe and once for the Israelite people, and he's going to do it again. And my participation in it is to recognize that he's going to do it. And how crazy that he picked, like, these are things you can teach a 5-year-old. Like, no, today we don't have to work because God does the work. I remember Dr. Block had a huge influence on me. He's like the 9th of 13 children from Saskatchewan, like you need a story like that. And his dad was a potato farmer, and they had like a 3-bedroom home, whatever. Like, he has these crazy stories, and his dad was the only farmer in the area that refused to work on Saturday, and it sometimes was life or death. I mean, if the hail is coming, you harvest your crop today or you don't. And his dad would be like, no. Which, I'm not saying that's how we should live. I'm saying that example, that picture of how he did live impacts even me in terms of what it meant to him, where his role in this process was. He's invited in, but he's not in charge. Like, all of these, God's got it. And even in practicing Sabbath, because we can talk about the practical of it, sometimes we're Sabbathing from work that feels like you're so needed in the equation. Sometimes we're Sabbathing from something that even if we work on, we cannot fix. I remember when my mom was walking through cancer, or when Carl was walking through cancer, Sabbath almost seems to fly in the face of that because I can't fix it. God might not fix it now, those kinds of things. But I'm reminded that I feel like about grief, that he will redeem everything. So for me, grief doesn't have as much immediate hope as some Christians like to encourage me toward. I'm like, yeah, but I don't want that someday. I want it now. But one day a week, I can rest in the hope. And then I let myself just grieve for the other 6 days, still even a year later, because I want immediate fixes for these things. But I can set that aside regularly and go, okay, you're right, God, I don't have to grieve as one who doesn't have hope. I don't quite know what to do with that, but regularly I can remind myself and reinfuse.
Let me ask you a serious question. If something triggered a major market drop in the coming months, would your retirement be ready or exposed? With inflation, market volatility, and ongoing global uncertainty, more families are taking a closer look at whether their retirement plan is truly built to hold up. And many are finding that adding a layer of protection makes a lot of sense. Sanctuary Metals is a Christian-owned company that helps families strengthen their retirement savings with physical gold and silver through a gold IRA. During During uncertain times, many people look to precious metals as a way to add stability when other assets may be under pressure. If you'd like to explore whether a gold IRA is a good fit for your situation, Sanctuary Metals makes it easy to get started. Text GUIDE to 94878 to receive your free retirement defense guide, or call 888-958-6579 to speak with one of their knowledgeable team members. Again, text GUIDE to 94878 or call 888-958-6579. Let's be honest. Ever read a passage and wonder what it really means in its original context? True Bible study isn't just casual reading. It's about connecting historical background, cross-references, and themes. If you've ever felt like navigating all that is just too difficult, you need to check out Logos. Logos is a game-changing platform that equips you to explore hard questions with absolute confidence, knowing you're drawing from reliable, well-respected academic resources. Whether you're at your desk or on the go, Logos helps you follow that path of discovery naturally. With their new AI tools, you can ask Logos any biblical question and get trusted answers from a biblical library. To help you dive into the layers of meaning in the Word, Logos is offering my listeners an exclusive free 60-day trial. Just go to logos.com/deep. That's LOGOS.com/deep to claim your free 60-day trial. Let's stop guessing and start going deeper together.
And that's one of my goofy Sabbath practices. Anyway, all of that to say what behind the Sabbath for me is what God wants us to understand about who he is. I think it's very significant that the Bible begins with, I did it all perfectly, and ends with, and I'm going to fix it all again.
Yeah.
And one day a week, we sit in that.
So I think we want to transition to the practical side of this, unless Renee, you have anything to add?
No, let's keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just say this. I think that as we look at the law, there are laws that are much more challenging than the Sabbath to understand how to see the character of God behind them, right? I was just doing some research on Deuteronomy 23:1 the other day. This is about people with crushed testicles not being able to enter the assembly.
And Leviticus 21. Those are my favorites.
Yeah, Leviticus 21, right. I mean, you've got these really, for us, strange laws that are simply stated with no real commentary. And I think that one of the reasons I like the Sabbath laws, I think some of the other ones that we've talked about, muzzling the oxen when it's treading grain, right? All these is because they start to give you glimpses of how we're supposed to read the law. God's more explicit, and that's what I mean by commentary. He's giving more explicit texture to each of these laws. And so you sit back and you go, well, is it just for this one, or is it for a bunch of others? Mm-hmm. And I think combined with, Renee, what you mentioned about the story and the narrative, where we understand the stories, we see the stories, we get an understanding of how the dynamic works between us and God, who God is and who we are in relation to him. This then adds force as we move into the law. And now we look at something like the Sabbath command, where at first rooted in creation, then rooted in Exodus, and you go, oh, I'm starting to get it now. I'm starting to see how we're supposed to read these laws. It's not just a checklist, that my to-do list for the day. It's now shaping something of who God is that I'm supposed to respond to. And these laws help the Israelites to respond to God, right? They were to help the Israelites respond to God, but not just that. They're also to help me respond to God, to understand who he is. And as we respond, that may look very, very different. Mm-hmm. And I think so as we pivot over into Sabbath, it can be easy when you read the rest of the 10 Commandments, right? Well, should we not murder in the same way the Israelites didn't murder? Should we not steal in the same way the Israelites didn't steal? And you're kind of like, there's a little one-to-one that comes across, right? Culturally, like those are pretty, maybe stealing's kind of, we keep that one, right? And it's pretty steady. But Sabbath is one of those where we kind of sit back and go, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It just doesn't need redefinition culturally.
It really doesn't. But the Sabbath is one of those that I think really does. You know, it really does need a redefinition. It's got some robustness to it that I think we have to sort of revisit and say, is this really about taking Sunday off? Is that a necessary application or a practical outworking of this command? Or could it be an optional way, depending on where we are in the world right now? So I'll kind of leave it there, but I wanted to give people a little bit of a framework, like as they're reading the law. I think these are really great touch points to go, this isn't an exceptional way of reading the law. It's probably the normative way of reading the law. and it should inform the way we read some of the odder ones that we run into. That's right. So with all that sort of preamble out of the way, I'll just start with it. I'm interested to understand how each of you would think about Sabbath. Now, Becky, you've already kind of given us a little bit of glimpse in how you do this. Renee, how do you think about Sabbath in your daily life? Do you think about it? Is this something you practice? Yeah, just thoughts.
I don't have really hard and fast, like, ritual or rhythm that I adhere to. I think that's probably primarily because I'm the mom of 4. So having 6 people in my stead, like, there's a lot of life that I don't have control over anyway. But I will say that the idea, at least of, I mean, let's just even take like the most obvious, like we go to church every Sunday. We go to church every Sunday as a family. And that didn't used to seem like such a thing. Like we didn't make it a really hard and fast rule. It was a pattern to our life. As our kids have gotten older and we've also moved to a different area of the country, more of the rest of life is starting to ask for that time from us. I've got kids in athletics and opportunities to be in greater athletics or traveling athletics or even just social things. And as that is kind of like coming in and asking for more of us, we have laid a pattern of Sundays being a day that we attend church together and we eat lunch together. And like, it's funny how I would say like, well, I don't know that I like really like make this my Sabbath, but it is just a part of our life that now I see is giving me reason to push back against some of that more taking from us. And I don't know. I think that's probably the most obvious primary way in which we do as a family. I think our kids just kind of assume it's just built in. We don't talk about it really heavily. Like, this is our Sabbath. This is what we're teaching you, but it just is part of our life. And that's what Sabbath is intended to be, like, not a arbitrary legalistic thing, but a rhythm and a pattern. And so that's probably the primary way that it shows up in my life, because of the season of life that I'm in.
Yeah, I resonate with that. I've got 4 kids, 3 of which are still, I guess, minors. My son's 20. And so he's still around, but he's much more doing his own thing now. And, but yeah, the other 3 still need things, and my girls do travel sports, and that's been interesting and challenging. I will say that. And I think that as we've done the travel sports thing and have been gone on Sundays, or work pulls us away on Sundays, what I've experienced is there is a real grind that you can get into. I remember this. I was working as a personal trainer through my MDiv, and I used to work Monday through Saturday. So we were poor and I had to pay rent. And so I'd work 40 hours a week plus do my master, like I had a full-time job. And so my boss scheduled me some clients on a Sunday one week. And, I was in my 20s. Like, you feel pretty much invulnerable to anything in your 20s, right? And so I remember going in that Sunday, training the clients, going back on Monday, and by the next Saturday being absolutely exhausted. It was only a couple clients on a Sunday, no big deal. It's not like it was all day or whatever. I was absolutely fried. And I think that feeling of, man, those weeks just ran together. There's no punctuation or separation. There's no sacredness of time within that, where you get to sort of break things up and go, no, now this work week is over. This next work week is going to start. But in this center part, I have this sacred moment. I think sometimes when we're doing the travel sports and all that kind of stuff now, I start to feel that way. It's as enjoyable as it is, much more fun than working. But as enjoyable as it is, you do start to, it's like something starts to nag at you, like you're missing something. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, Sabbath practice has become something I'm much more keen to over the last several years, when we've been doing a lot of that and trying to figure out, like, what does this really look like in the midst of busy schedules that don't always line up and, whatever. And so it's been interesting. But I will say, I think for a big part of mine is just an internal clock that I don't always pay attention to, which is you've done enough work, you can stop now. Right. My internal clock that says you've done enough work, you can stop now, doesn't always work. Right. I usually hit the snooze alarm, or whatever we want to say. And so I'll find myself overworked on these sort of quasi regular bases. And I'm like, no, man, I gotta stop. Like this constant stuff has to end. And so I think there's a built-in sort of mechanism, at least in my life, where I just sit back and say, I should have been taking the rest. Now I really need the rest. Why is it that I just don't take the rest more regularly? So that's my experience with Sabbath. And having written a dissertation on it, it's always puzzling that I can't figure it out. So
what I'm loving about this conversation is that what I'm hearing reflected, and I hear it really strongly because I resonate with it in my own life so deeply, is the invitation and the freedom and the benefits, with totally devoid of rules and definition and here's what day of the week. And I think sometimes for Christians, when we get in this conversation, we're so afraid of doing it wrong because we're required that we're asking for all of these definitions around it. And it's not that there shouldn't be any. I don't know. They're not clear. I have no idea. So instead of addressing all that, what I usually tell people, including myself, because I am if there could be a rule, I will feel safe and I can follow it, or I can break it and know I'm breaking it, but one or the other. And as believers, we need to understand that if we break it all the time, that's already paid for. That's already taken, like the messing up part is already taken care of. And like, it's okay. So I'm hearing you guys talk about it from a very practical place. And I think that's what it's supposed to be. So I find that absolutely beautiful. My experience, like Renee, 4 kids, grad school, crazy life, dissertation, period of life was really intense for me. I had 8 pregnancies during this time, so my body was a mess. My heart was a mess because we were grieving losses. We were broke as dirt. I mean, the whole thing, Becky lives above and beyond and does not know how to stop or doesn't feel sufficient ever, so doesn't stop. And so for me, when it became most crucial was when things were at such a high stake for completion that the only way it was going to happen was with built-in pause. And so Sabbath became most important to me at the time when I could afford it the least. And it wasn't like it wasn't that I sat and thought, oh, today I can remember that God doesn't need me to do this. And that, it wasn't any of that. It was literally like, as a believer, I know I'm supposed to do this, and I don't know how to not, I'm dying. I'm not keeping it up. And then once I applied that, our whole family did. I didn't try to get things done on Saturday. We went to church and things like that, but I didn't try to do a dissertation. Jim didn't schedule work. At times we didn't even cook. We were like, we're exhausted. There was no homeschooling. There was no anything. And that became so physically empowering that I ended up I didn't even understand the theology of it. But in my case, at that point, it didn't matter. I ended up reaping the benefits and then seeing behind it like, oh, you are finite. You are totally dependent, and you aren't really that needed by God. And it's, all of these things, and it is going to be okay. And you don't have that much, so I learned those things at a very important time. Like Renee, we don't have firm rules or days or expectations, but it's a privilege I wholeheartedly step into as someone who needs a social excuse to take a break, because I don't feel valuable enough to just say, oh, because I need one. And that's what Sabbath is to me. And I don't, it feels like I should apologize for that, but I feel like that's what it was given for.
I think it's really interesting. So I read a quote the other day. I got on Facebook and I read a quote on Facebook. Always a really horrible idea.
Wow.
But it was, men don't fail because they're too aggressive. Men fail more often because they're too passive. It's because they wait and they refuse to act. And, it was kind of one of those quotes. And I can't quote it verbatim.
Yeah.
But when I thought about it, I have this idea that I kind of come back to. It's a little pithy statement that I say, but our role is to respond to God from within a situation, not to respond to the situation as if God were active or irrelevant.
Yeah.
And so when I read things like that are so hard one way, right? As if inactivity and passivity, restraint, right, are just really leaning you toward failure. I think to myself, no, we've got to be able to respond to God from within the situation as opposed to responding to the situation as if God were absent or irrelevant. One of the responses within that range to respond faithfully to God has to be to rest. And I think that because we generally don't have this sort of, and I think it's been eroded, we used to have more of a Sundays off, nothing's open, there's no sports, like that time used to be guarded. It's not anymore. And I'm very seldom a fan of, hey, let's bring the horses back in the barn, right? I think culture moves past and that one act just probably isn't going to work that well. Like things have to shift and change in much more complex ways. And so as we are, I almost think of it as the Jews without the temple. And they stand there and they say, then what do we do?
Yep.
Right. And they come up with and yes, they take some blasts in the Gospels, but I think a lot of times what they're trying to do at heart is how do we walk with God? How do we demonstrate that we are his people without the temple? Because it was kind of central to us. And I think we should be thinking about Sabbath in much the same way, given that Sunday has been co-opted for a number of different purposes and it's no longer reserved just for worship. How do we now build sacred time back into our lives, given that we no longer really have access to Sunday? And I think that then lends itself to how do we respond to God in the moment, as opposed to responding to the situation, as if, hey, all Christians, stop doing any travel sports, stop doing anything else. You got to be back in church on Sunday. Like, I suppose that's the utopian vision, but I just don't think it's particularly realistic. And it's certainly not that helpful. And so to me, it's like, that's probably the wrong direction to go. The right direction to go is to say, how do we help Christians understand how to cultivate sacred time in a cultural moment where busyness is driving us further and further away, not just from Sunday, but from dependence on God, sort of like what you were talking about, Becky.
Yeah.
So
I want to real quickly just add one for those people who are listening and are like, okay, that all sounds good, but how do I know that that's biblical? I always need those concrete, like something from the Bible that blows up my view of what I think Sabbath has to be. So when in Ezra and Nehemiah, and I don't remember if it's there or I think it is, or Haggai, but I think it's Ezra and Nehemiah, when the people are breaking Sabbath constantly, because God tells the Levites to go work, strap on, I think they strap on swords, but I can't quite remember, and stand at the gates and monitor, which is a job. Like,
right.
So sometimes, go do something. And,
right.
And so that other people don't do something, and you're like, what? And for me, that takes this, like, if Israel was obeying it, they would literally be laying in their tents all day, eating manna from yesterday, and would reemerge from their hibernation on Monday morning, and no one would have anything. And that's not consistent with even how it's portrayed. So the fact that it gets a little muddied sometimes is part of even how God is instructing it in the Bible. And I don't think we need to be scared by that. We can be a little baffled. We can, so I just.
Well, I think you have the Jesus passages, where he's healing on the Sabbath and those kind of things too. And you sort of step back and what you realize is, okay, we shouldn't trivialize the Sabbath, but we shouldn't make an idol of it either. And so we've got to recognize that sacred time is sacred, not because that time is reserved for inactivity. It's sacred because we are to be honoring God within it. And so there's sort of a different texture, I think, to what we're looking at when we think about Sabbath. And even just to sort of almost end where we started with Hebrews, you have this rest that is coming for the people of God. And so there, even in Hebrews, you have this sort of widening out of what it means to have rest. It isn't just this seventh day that everybody wants to do. It's something further down the road that we now will participate in the rest that God is already doing. So, throw it out there. Any last words? Otherwise, we'll close this one out. Last thoughts? Really helpful conversation. Appreciate it, everybody. And hopefully this is fun for everybody else too. Sabbath's one of my favorite topics. So really appreciate y'all having this conversation with me. And thanks everybody for taking the time to listen in. All right. We'll call it a day there, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Thinking Christian. Just want to take a second to thank the team at Life Audio for their partnership with us on the Thinking Christian podcast. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.